The Grand Astoria Ballroom in New York City glittered under the weight of opulence, its crystal chandeliers casting fractured light across a sea of tuxedos and shimmering gowns. The air was heavy with the scent of wealth, a heady mix of bespoke colognes, imported orchids flown in from halfway across the globe, and the faint metallic tang of privilege that clung to every surface. For the elite gathered here, it was just another evening of self-congratulation, a night where a single plate of sous-vide quail cost more than a month's rent in Brooklyn. The occasion was the annual St. Augustine's Children's Fund Gala, a spectacle where New York's upper crust bid on abstract art and vintage wines to prove their generosity while sipping champagne that cost more per bottle than most people's car payments. For Aisha Thompson, however, it was the smell of survival, of another grueling 16-hour shift on her feet, her body moving through the chaos with the precision of a machine. Aisha, a black woman in her late 20s, was invisible in her starched black and white uniform, a ghost among the living. Her tray of Dom Perignon flutes, an extension of her arm, steady, balanced, and unnoticed. Her job was to glide through the crowd, delivering drinks and canapés without ever drawing attention to herself. She was part of the scenery, as essential and unregarded as the polished marble floors or the velvet drapes framing the ballroom's towering windows. Aisha had worked dozens of these events, and she knew their rhythm by heart, the polite murmurs that grew slurred as the night wore on, the air kisses that never connected, the laughter that sounded like breaking glass. She navigated past a woman in a diamond-encrusted gown, her necklace catching the light like a small constellation, and a man in a tailored suit who smelled faintly of cigars and entitlement. They didn't see her, didn't register her presence as she refilled their glasses or cleared their plates. To them, she was a function, not a person, a silent cog in the machinery of their evening. Her manager, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, a wiry woman with a perpetual crease of worry between her brows, had given her the usual pre-shift briefing. "Keep your head up, Thompson. These people can smell weakness. Be efficient, be polite, and, for heaven's sake, don't engage." Aisha had nodded, her expression blank, though inside she felt the familiar weight of exhaustion. Her feet ached in her sensible non-slip shoes, the kind designed for long hours, not comfort. Her mind, though, was elsewhere, tangled in the memory of a letter that had arrived that morning, its words like a bruise she couldn't stop pressing. "The Harlem Dance Academy Alumni Fund regrets to inform you." Another rejection, the fourth this year. It was a polite but firm reminder that her dreams of returning to the stage, of reclaiming the life she'd once been destined for, were slipping further out of reach. 5 years ago, Aisha had been a star at the Harlem Dance Academy, a prodigy whose instructors had whispered about her potential in hushed, reverent tones. Her movements were poetry fluid, powerful, a blend of balletic precision and the raw emotionality of modern dance. She'd been on track to graduate at the top of her class, with offers from dance companies already trickling in. But then, the world had shifted beneath her feet. Her mother, Clara, had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease, one that required expensive treatments and constant care. Aisha's father, a mechanic who ran a small auto shop in the Bronx, couldn't keep up with the bills. Aisha had made the choice to leave school, trading her leotards for a serving tray, her dreams of Broadway for the reality of hospital bills and a one-bedroom apartment in Queens. Sometimes, in the rare, quiet moments between tables, she could still feel the ghost of her old life. The warmth of stage lights on her skin, the thrum of an orchestra tuning up the electric silence of an audience holding its breath. It was a phantom ache, a memory of a life she had been forced to abandon. Tonight, as she wove through the gala's glittering chaos, Aisha was refilling water glasses at table 9, when she felt a shift in the air, a prickle of awareness that made her pause. It wasn't the usual indifferent glance of a guest looking for another drink. This was something sharper, more deliberate, a gaze that pinned her like a spotlight. She looked up, her professional smile faltering for a split second. The eyes belonged to Preston Caldwell, a man whose name she didn't know, but whose type she recognized instantly. He was in his early 30s, handsome in the way only inherited wealth could craft sharp jawline. Sandy blonde hair swept back with studied carelessness, a Patek Philippe watch glinting on his wrist. He lounged in his chair with the easy arrogance of someone who had never been denied anything, his bespoke tuxedo fitting him like a second skin. Preston was the heir to Caldwell Properties, a real estate empire that owned half the luxury condos in Manhattan's skyline. Flanking him were his fiancée, Vanessa Langston, a woman whose icy beauty seemed sculpted rather than born, and two men Aisha mentally dubbed Trevor and Blake, carbon copies of Preston, with less expensive watches and louder laughs. Preston's gaze lingered on Aisha, not with curiosity, but with a cold, dissecting amusement, as if she were a specimen he'd found mildly diverting. He leaned toward Vanessa, his voice a low drawl that carried over the hum of the crowd. "Look at her," he said, gesturing vaguely at Aisha. "Like a wind-up toy, just going through the motions. No spark, no life." Vanessa's lips curled into a crimson smirk, her eyes flicking over Aisha with the bored cruelty of a cat watching a trapped mouse. "Oh, darling, don't be mean," she purred, though her tone suggested she found his cruelty delicious. Trevor and Blake chuckled their laughter, a practiced chorus of agreement. Aisha's jaw tightened, but she kept pouring water, her movements deliberate, her face a mask of professionalism. "Don't engage," Mrs. Carter's voice echoed in her head. "Be a ghost." She finished the last glass and turned to leave, her back straight, her dignity, her only shield. "Excuse me." Preston's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Aisha froze, turning back slowly. "Sir," she said, her tone neutral. He pointed a manicured finger at his water glass, where a single droplet had landed on the pristine white tablecloth, no larger than a grain of rice. "You spilled," he said, his lips twitching into a smirk. "Sloppy work." The accusation was absurd, a deliberate jab meant to amuse his entourage. Trevor and Blake snickered, and Vanessa's eyes glinted with predatory delight. Aisha felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, rising in her chest. She'd endured countless slights tonight, the dismissive waves, the muttered complaints about slow service, the way guests spoke over her as if she weren't there. This, though, was different. This was personal, a calculated act of dominance meant to entertain. She took a breath, forcing her voice to remain steady. "My apologies, sir," she said. "I'll get a cloth to fix that immediately." Preston wasn't done. He leaned forward, his blue eyes gleaming with a spark of malice. "Fix it," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I don't think a cloth is going to fix the general air of mediocrity here tonight." He took a slow sip of his champagne, the glass catching the light, as he set it down with a soft clink. The band on the main stage had just finished a languid jazz number and was transitioning into something bolder, a fiery tango, Astor Piazzolla's Libertango, its staccato rhythm slicing through the ballroom. Preston's smirk widened, a dangerous glint in his eyes. He'd had an idea, one that promised to elevate his evening from mundane to memorable. "You know," he said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby tables, "my friends and I were just saying how lifeless everyone is tonight. No passion, no fire." His gaze locked onto Aisha, pinning her in place. "I'll bet you've never felt a moment of real passion in your life, have you?" Aisha stood frozen, her tray still balanced in her hands, as the weight of his words settled over her. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, sensing the brewing spectacle. Vanessa's eyes widened, a flicker of surprise giving way to amusement. "Preston, don't be ridiculous," she said, her protest weak, designed to egg him on. "I'm not being ridiculous," he replied, standing up, his 6-foot frame towering over the table. "I'm making a point." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek money clip, peeling off a stack of $100 bills with a theatrical flourish. The crisp notes fanned out in his hand, a display of power as much as wealth. $10,000, he announced, his voice ringing with challenge. "That's your tip, if you can dance this tango with me right here, right now, and not make a fool of yourself. But if you stumble, if you can't keep up, you get nothing, and I'll make sure you're out of a job." He glanced at Mrs. Carter, who was hurrying toward the table, her face pale with dread. "I'll see to it personally." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The audacity of the dare, the sheer cruelty of it, hung in the air like a storm cloud. It wasn't just a dance he was proposing. It was a public humiliation, a spectacle designed to reinforce the chasm between their worlds. Preston, with his private dance lessons and Ivy League polish, against Aisha, a black waitress in orthopedic shoes, her hands calloused from years of labor. The power imbalance was grotesque, and he knew it. He expected her to shrink, to refuse to prove his point, that she was nothing more than a servant in his world. Aisha's heart pounded, her pulse loud in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to retreat to the safety of invisibility. But then she looked at him, really looked at him. His smug certainty, the way his lips curled as if her failure was already assured, ignited something deep within her. It wasn't just about tonight. It was every slight she'd endured, every dream she'd buried, every time she'd been forced to swallow her pride to survive. She thought of her mother lying in a hospital bed, her face lined with pain, but still smiling when Aisha visited. She thought of the rejection letters piling up on her kitchen table, each one a reminder that her talent was no match for her circumstances. And she thought of the stage, the way the wooden floor felt under her feet, the way the music had once moved through her like a second heartbeat. That life was gone, but its echo remained a stubborn spark that refused to die. Then she looked at the money in Preston's hand. $10,000. It was a lifeline enough to cover her mother's medication for months, to pay off the overdue electric bill, to give her a moment to breathe. But it was also an insult, a bribe to degrade herself for his amusement. The choice was impossible, yet it was no choice at all. She couldn't let him win, not like this. Across the room, Marcus Reed, a freelance photographer hired to capture the gala's glamour, lowered his camera. He'd been watching the exchange, his lens initially trained on Preston as a prime subject for the society pages. But now his focus shifted to Aisha. He saw the way her shoulders squared, the way her eyes flickered with something fierce and unbroken. He adjusted his lens, zooming in on her face, sensing that this moment was about to become the story of the night. Aisha took a slow, deliberate breath, her gaze meeting Preston's. The noise of the ballroom faded, the chatter and clinking glasses dissolving into a distant hum. She set her tray down on a nearby stand, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Okay," she said, her voice clear and unshaken. "I accept." A shocked murmur rippled through the crowd, the tango's rhythm suddenly deafening in the silence. Preston's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, a crack in his arrogance. He hadn't expected her to say yes. The dare was meant to intimidate, to force her to back down and confirm his dominance. Her acceptance shifted the ground beneath him, but his ego, vast and insatiable, quickly recovered. "Excellent," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's see what you've got." He gestured to the small open space between the tables, a makeshift stage for his cruel theater. "The floor is yours." "Ours," he corrected, his smirk returning. Vanessa laughed a sound like shards of ice, while Mrs. Carter reached the table, her voice a desperate whisper. "Mr. Caldwell, this is inappropriate. Aisha, go to the kitchen now." But Aisha didn't move. Her eyes were locked on Preston's, and for the first time that night she wasn't invisible. "It's fine, Mrs. Carter," she said, her voice firm. "He made an offer. I accepted." The stage was set, and the ballroom held its breath, waiting to see what would happen when a waitress dared to step into the spotlight. The Grand Astoria ballroom seemed to contract around Aisha Thompson as she stood in the center of the small improvised dance floor, the weight of 100 pairs of eyes pressing against her skin. The sharp, seductive notes of Astor Piazzolla's Libertango filled the air, its bandoneon wailing like a heartbeat, urgent and alive. Aisha's pulse matched its rhythm, a mix of adrenaline and defiance coursing through her veins. She had just accepted Preston Caldwell's cruel dare, a $10,000 bet, to dance a tango with him without faltering, a public spectacle designed to humiliate her in front of New York's elite. The money fanned out in his manicured hand was both a lifeline and an insult, a reminder of the chasm between her world and his. But Aisha wasn't thinking about the money now. She was thinking about the stage she'd left behind 5 years ago, the dreams she'd buried under hospital bills and double shifts. She was thinking about the way Preston's smirk dripped with contempt, as if her failure was a foregone conclusion. And she was thinking about the fire in her chest, a spark that had been dormant too long, but was now roaring to life. Preston strode toward her, his confidence a tangible force, his bespoke tuxedo catching the light of the chandeliers. He extended his hand with a flourish of mock chivalry, his blue eyes glinting with the certainty of victory. "Shall we?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. Aisha ignored his hand, stepping past him to the center of the cleared space. She closed her eyes for a fleeting moment, shutting out the glittering chaos of the ballroom. In that brief darkness, the scent of orchids and champagne faded, replaced by the familiar smell of rosin and polished wood, the echo of her old dance studio in Harlem. She could almost hear her instructor's voice, a gravelly command from years ago. "Feel the music, Aisha. Don't just follow it. Let it live in you." She opened her eyes, and the world snapped back into focus. The tango's melody was building a dangerous promise of passion and precision. She knew this piece intimately. She'd choreographed a solo to it during her final year at the Harlem Dance Academy, a performance she'd never had the chance to present. Now it was as if the music had been waiting for her all these years. Aisha turned to face Preston, her expression no longer the polite mask of a waitress, but something alive, fierce, and unreadable. "Ready when you are," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Preston's grin widened, mistaking her calm for nervousness. He grabbed her hand, pulling her into a traditional tango frame, his grip too tight, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who'd paid for private lessons but never truly felt the music. He intended to lead, to dominate the dance, as he dominated everything else in his life. He launched into a basic forward ocho, a figure-8 step, expecting her to stumble in her sensible black socks, her clunky work shoes discarded moments earlier. For the first 2 steps, she let him guide her, her movements pliant, following his lead with a deceptive ease. Preston glanced at his fiancée, Vanessa Langston, who watched from their table with a crimson-lipped smirk, and his expression said it all. This is going to be easy. Then everything changed. On the 3rd step, as Preston prepared to pivot, Aisha didn't just follow, she anticipated. Her frame, which had been soft and yielding, became electric with intent. Her hand on his back shifted from a follower's touch to a guide's, using his own momentum to spin them both with a speed and precision that caught him off guard. He stumbled for a split second, his polished posture breaking his smirk, vanishing like smoke. The bandoneon surged, and Aisha came alive. She was no longer Aisha Thompson, the invisible waitress. She was Aisha the dancer, a force of grace and power who had once commanded auditoriums. Her feet bare, except for her black socks, glided across the plush carpet with a fluidity her work shoes had hidden. She wasn't just executing steps. She was interpreting the music, her body a living extension of the tango's passionate, sorrowful soul. Preston tried to regain control, his jaw tightening as he attempted a more complex sequence, a giro, a turning step he'd likely practiced in a mirrored studio on the Upper East Side. But Aisha wasn't just turning. She embellished the move, her free leg hooking around his, in a swift, sharp gancho that was both technically flawless and breathtakingly bold. It was a move he hadn't anticipated, one that didn't exist in his expensive lessons. He froze for a microsecond, his mind scrambling to catch up. The crowd, which had been watching with a mix of curiosity and schadenfreude, fell silent, their champagne flutes forgotten. They were witnessing something extraordinary. A reversal of power, a moment where the rules of their world were upended. Aisha saw the flicker of panic in Preston's eyes, the beads of sweat forming on his brow, and she felt a surge of something wild and fierce. This wasn't about the $10,000 or $1,000 anymore. It was about every rejection she'd faced, every indignity she'd swallowed, every moment she'd been made to feel small. This was her stage, and Preston was merely a prop. She began to lead subtly at first, then with undeniable authority. She guided him backward, her steps intricate and sure, forcing him into sequences he clearly didn't know. His movements became jerky, reactive, his polished facade cracking with every misstep. Aisha was dancing circles around him literally and figuratively. She executed a series of rapid bolios, her legs snapping with precision, drawing invisible arcs around Preston's clumsy feet. The music swelled to its crescendo, and Aisha drove him back one final time, then spun away, her arms snapping out in a dramatic pose, her chest heaving, her chin high. The final discordant chord of the tango hung in the air, sharp and unresolved. Preston stood alone in the center of the space, breathing heavily, his face a mottled red mask of shock and humiliation. He looked like a man who'd just realized he'd lost a game he didn't even know he was playing. For a heartbeat, the ballroom was silent, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Then a single clap broke the stillness, followed by another, and suddenly the room erupted. It wasn't the polite applause of high society. It was a roar, a wave of raw admiration from people who had paid $25,000 a table to be here. They were on their feet, clapping, cheering, some even whistling for a black waitress in black socks, who had just turned their world upside down. The sound crashed over Aisha, overwhelming a physical force that made her skin prickle. For a moment, she was back at the Harlem Dance Academy, taking a bow after a grueling performance, the adrenaline and exhaustion mixing with the pure joy of connecting with an audience. But this wasn't a stage. She opened her eyes and saw the sea of stunned faces, wealthy, privileged faces that had never looked at her before this moment. She saw Mrs. Carter, her manager standing near the service stand, her hands clasped over her mouth, tears glistening in her eyes. She saw Marcus Reed, the photographer, his camera still raised, his face lit with awe as he captured the moment. And she saw Preston Caldwell. The roar of the crowd was a verdict, and he knew it. His face, already red, deepened to a furious crimson. The confidence, the entitlement, the smirk, all of it had been stripped away, leaving only the raw, ugly core of his arrogance. He had been outdone publicly and spectacularly by someone he'd dismissed as nothing. The applause began to fade, and a new tension crackled in the air. Preston took a step forward, his movements sharp and jerky, his eyes burning with a hatred that made Aisha's stomach twist. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the money clip again. This time there was no flourish, no showmanship. He ripped the stack of $10,000 from the clip and with a vicious flick of his wrist threw the bills at Aisha's feet. The $100 notes fluttered to the carpet, scattering like confetti, an insult disguised as a reward. "There's your tip," he spat, his voice low and venomous. "You wanted a show. You got one. Now get out of my sight." The crowd gasped, the sound sharp and collective. The act was brutal, a final attempt to reassert his dominance, to reduce Aisha's triumph to a transaction. To remind her that in his world, she was still just the help. Aisha looked down at the money littering the floor around her socked feet. $10,000. It was more than she'd seen in one place in her life. It was months of her mother's medication, a chance to fix the leak in her apartment's ceiling, a buffer against the relentless grind of survival. The practical part of her brain screamed at her to bend down to gather the bills, to swallow this final indignity for the sake of her family. But then she looked up at Preston's face. There was no remorse there, no respect, only the bitter fury of a man who'd been exposed. And she knew she couldn't take it. To pick up that money would be to validate his worldview, to admit that her talent, her pride, her soul could be bought for a stack of bills. With a calm that surprised even herself, Aisha met his gaze. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice quiet, but razor-sharp, cutting through the silence of the ballroom. "I didn't dance for your money. I danced for me." She took a deliberate step back away from the scattered bills, her eyes never leaving his. "My art isn't for sale." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Then, without another glance at the money, she turned and walked off the dance floor. Her movements were unhurried, regal each step, a rejection of the role she'd been forced to play all night. She passed the stunned tables, ignoring Vanessa's frozen smile. Trevor and Blake's dropped jaws. She walked to the service stand where she'd left her apron and shoes, picking them up with a quiet dignity. The crowd watched, mesmerized, as she moved toward the service door leading to the kitchens. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Thompson?" "Hey," she began, but Aisha cut her off with a small, weary smile. "It's okay, Mrs. Carter," she said. "I think I'm done here." She pushed open the door and disappeared into the clatter and steam of the back of the house, leaving behind a stunned ballroom, a humiliated millionaire, and $10,000 lying untouched on the floor. Across the room, Marcus Reed lowered his camera, his heart pounding. He'd captured it all: the dare, the dance, the thrown money, Aisha's defiant exit. He scrolled through the images on his camera's display, his breath catching at the power of what he'd witnessed. There was Aisha, her back arched in a perfect line during the tango, her eyes burning with intensity. There was Preston, his face contorted with shock as he realized he was losing control. And there was the final shot, Aisha's back, as she walked away, the money scattered at her feet, a testament to her refusal to be bought. Marcus knew this wasn't just a set of gala photos. This was a story, a narrative of defiance, talent, and raw human spirit. He looked up, a slow grin spreading across his face. He had the scoop of the year, and he knew exactly how to tell it. Meanwhile, at a table near the dance floor, a woman in her late 60s leaned forward, her eyes alight with a spark of professional interest. Eleanor Hayes, a legendary Broadway choreographer whose productions had defined the theater district for decades, had been on the verge of leaving the gala, bored by its predictable pomp. Now she was riveted. She hadn't just seen a waitress outdance a rich fool. She'd seen technique clean, precise, and infused with a rare emotional depth. She recognized the training in Aisha's movements, the signature of a specific school, a specific kind of dancer. She turned to her assistant, a young man scribbling notes in a leather-bound planner. "Find out who that woman is," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I don't care what it takes. I want her name, and I want to see her in my studio tomorrow." The gala might have been a showcase for charity, but for Eleanor Hayes, it had just become the audition of a lifetime. The morning after the gala at the Grand Astoria Ballroom, Aisha Thompson woke to the sound of her phone buzzing relentlessly on the chipped Formica nightstand in her small Queens apartment. The lumpy mattress beneath her creaked as she shifted her body, aching from the previous night's 16-hour shift and the adrenaline-fueled tango that had turned her world upside down. The memory of her dance with Preston Caldwell, the arrogant heir to Caldwell Properties, played in her mind like a vivid dream. The way she'd outshone him, the way she'd walked away from his $10,000, the way the ballroom had erupted in applause. But in the cold light of day, the triumph felt fragile, overshadowed by the reality of what she'd done. She'd quit her job publicly, humiliated a powerful man, and left a life-changing sum of money scattered out on the floor. Her mother's next round of medication was due in a week, and the rent was already late. Aisha rubbed her eyes, the weight of her choices settling like a stone in her chest. She reached for her phone, its cracked screen lighting up with a flood of notifications, texts, missed calls, and a link from a former co-worker that made her heart skip. "OMG Aisha, are you seeing this?" The text read, followed by a URL. She tapped it, and her breath caught. The story was everywhere, splashed across the homepage of Vibe Pulse, an online news outlet known for its viral scoops. The headline was bold and unforgiving: "Millionaire heir dares black waitress to dance for $10K. She wipes the floor with him and walks away." The article, written by Marcus Reed, the photographer who'd captured every moment of the gala, was a masterclass in storytelling. It painted the scene with vivid detail: the opulent ballroom, Preston's smug dare, Aisha's breathtaking performance, and her defiant refusal of the money. The photos were the real gut punch, a triptych that was already ricocheting across social media. The first showed Preston smirking, fanning the cash like a poker player. The second captured Aisha, mid-tango, her body a blur of grace and power, Preston's face a mask of dawning horror. The third was the most powerful, Aisha's back, as she walked away, the $10,000 scattered at her feet, a symbol of her unyielding pride. By noon, Gala Dancer was trending #1 on Twitter, with Preston Caldwell's shame close behind. The comments section of the article was a tidal wave of support. "This is the queen we need," one user wrote. "She didn't just dance, she took his soul and left the cash," said another. "Someone give this woman a Broadway contract now." Aisha scrolled through the reactions, her hands trembling. Yesterday, she'd been invisible, a black waitress blending into the background of a world that didn't see her. Today, she was a symbol, her face and story plastered across screens worldwide. A GoFundMe page, started by a stranger with the title "A Tip Jar for the Gala Dancer," had already raised $20,000, far surpassing its $10,000 goal. The outpouring was surreal, but it also filled her with a creeping dread. The internet was a fickle beast, and fame like this could vanish as quickly as it came. More troubling was the realization that her name was out there now. Amateur sleuths had dug up her identity, connecting her to the Harlem Dance Academy. How long before they uncovered the rest of her story? Across town, in a glass and steel penthouse office overlooking Central Park, the mood was far less celebratory. Preston Caldwell Sr., a man whose cold, calculated presence made his son's arrogance seem like child's play, stared at the New York Post spread across his mahogany desk. The headline screamed, "Tango Takedown Heir, Humiliated by Waitress." The accompanying photo, one of Marcus Reed's, showed Preston Jr.'s red-faced fury as Aisha walked away. Preston Sr.'s fist clenched the jade figurines on his desk, rattling. "What the hell were you thinking?" he roared, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Preston Jr. stood before him, pale and defiant, his $5,000 suit doing little to shield him from his father's wrath. "It was a joke, Dad," he muttered. "It got out of hand." A joke, his father bellowed, standing up. Though shorter than his son, Preston Sr.'s aura filled the room, a storm of controlled rage. "Our stock dropped 3% this morning because of your joke. The St. Augustine's Fund is considering pulling our sponsorship. Board members are calling, investors are panicking, and you think this is a joke?" Preston Jr. shifted uncomfortably, his usual swagger replaced by a sullen scowl. Vanessa Langston. His fiancée had already distanced herself, issuing a statement to the press about irreconcilable values in a move that reeked of self-preservation. His friends Trevor and Blake weren't returning his calls. The social circle he'd dominated for years was turning on him, their admiration replaced by whispers of pity and scorn. "I'll fix it," he said, his voice weak. "You'll fix nothing," his father snapped. "You've done enough damage. You're to stay out of the public eye. No press, no social media, nothing until I say so. Get out." Preston Jr. slunk out of the office, the weight of his humiliation heavier than ever. His father turned to the window, his mind racing. This wasn't just a PR crisis. It was a threat to the Caldwell empire, one that records swift, ruthless action. Back in Queens, Aisha's day took a turn she couldn't have imagined. Around 3 p.m., a knock on her apartment door startled her. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a woman in a tailored blazer, her expression professional, but not intrusive. Aisha opened the door cautiously. "Aisha Thompson." The woman asked, her tone crisp. "I'm Lauren Brooks, personal assistant to Eleanor Hayes. Ms. Hayes was at the gala last night and was very impressed by your performance. She'd like to meet you tomorrow at her studio in the Theater District, 10 a.m., if you're available." She handed Aisha a card, thick cream-colored, embossed with a simple address. Aisha stared at it, her mind reeling. Eleanor Hayes was a legend, a choreographer whose Broadway shows like Midnight Rhapsody and City of Shadows had redefined modern dance. A meeting with her wasn't just an opportunity. It was a resurrection of a dream Aisha had buried years ago. "I'll be there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lauren nodded and left, and Aisha closed the door, leaning against it, the card clutched in her hand like a lifeline. As the reality of the invitation sank in, Aisha's thoughts drifted to a darker truth. The name Caldwell had triggered a memory, one she'd pushed down for years. Her father, James Thompson, had owned a small auto repair shop in the Bronx, a family business that had been his pride and joy. 5 years ago, he'd secured a contract to service a fleet of vehicles for a luxury condo project on the waterfront, a deal that was supposed to secure their future. But, halfway through, the developer, a subsidiary of Caldwell Properties, had pulled out, citing a technicality in the contract. It was a lie, a maneuver to switch to a cheaper overseas supplier. The loss had bankrupted James's business, forcing him to sell the shop and their family home. The stress had led to a stroke, leaving him unable to work and piling medical bills on top of their already strained finances. Aisha had dropped out of the Harlem Dance Academy to support her parents, her dreams sacrificed to survival. She hadn't known Preston Caldwell's name at the gala, but seeing Caldwell Properties in the news articles that morning had connected the dots. The man who'd dared her to dance was the son of the family that had destroyed her father's livelihood. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The tango hadn't just been a moment of defiance, It was a collision of her past and present, a cruel twist of fate that tied her to the Caldwells in ways she hadn't understood until now. She sat on her couch, the worn fabric scratching against her jeans, and let the weight of it settle. The viral story, the GoFundMe, the meeting with Eleanor Hayes. It was all overwhelming, but it was also a chance to reclaim what had been taken from her. Not just her career, but her voice, her story. She thought of her mother, Clara, who'd always told her, "Your talent is your power, Aisha. Don't let anyone make you forget that." For years, she'd felt powerless, but last night had changed something fundamental. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a force, and the world was starting to see it. The next morning, Aisha arrived at Eleanor Hayes' studio in the heart of the theater district, her stomach a knot of nerves. The space was everything she'd imagined. A cavernous room with scarred oak floors, floor-to-ceiling windows letting in the gray light of a New York morning, and a wall of mirrors reflecting decades of ambition. Photos of Eleanor's iconic productions lined another wall, their black and white drama, a testament to her legacy. Aisha felt out of place in her best pair of jeans and a simple navy sweater. Her wardrobe a stark reminder of the life she'd been living. Eleanor sat on a stool in the center of the room, a petite woman in her late 60s with piercing green eyes and a cascade of silver hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore a black turtleneck and pants, the uniform of a creative titan. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice warm but direct. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for inviting me, Ms. Hayes," Aisha replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Eleanor gestured to the empty floor. "Last night I saw something rare. That tango, libertango no less, wasn't just a dance. It was a story, a fight, a soul laid bare. I know training when I see it. Harlem Dance Academy, correct?" Aisha nodded, surprised. "Yes, I studied there, but I didn't graduate. I had to leave for personal reasons." Eleanor's eyes softened, but her gaze remained sharp, assessing. "I looked you up. Aisha Thompson, top of her class choreography award in your 3rd year. Then you disappeared. I'm not interested in the official reasons. I want the truth." Aisha hesitated, the question cutting deeper than she'd expected. But Eleanor's intensity demanded honesty. "My father's business went under," she began, her voice quiet. "He had a contract with a developer, a Caldwell Properties subsidiary. They broke it on a technicality, and it ruined him. He had a stroke. My mother's sick, too. I left school to work to pay the bills." Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable, but attentive. When Aisha finished, a heavy silence settled over the studio. "That's a heavy load for someone so young," Eleanor said finally. "Talent needs room to breathe, and you've been suffocating. But what I saw last night wasn't just talent. It was resilience. You didn't just dance. You fought." She paused, then asked, "The developer, did you know it was Caldwell's family when you took his dare?" Aisha shook her head. "Not until this morning, when I saw his name in the news." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, a flicker of anger in her eyes. "The universe has a cruel sense of humor," she muttered. She stood walking to the mirrored wall, her reflection a study in determination. "I'm working on a new show, Resonance. It's about a woman who loses everything and rebuilds herself through her art. The lead role requires a dancer with technical brilliance and emotional depth. I've auditioned hundreds across 3 continents, and I haven't found her. Until last night." Aisha's breath caught her hand, gripping the ballet bar for support. "I'm offering you an audition," Eleanor continued. "Not because of the viral story, but because I saw something in you, a fire that can't be taught. Are you interested?" Aisha's mind spun. An audition for a Broadway show under Eleanor Hayes was more than a dream. It was a miracle. "I haven't danced seriously in 5 years," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm out of shape." Eleanor waved a hand dismissively. "Muscle remembers. So does the soul. We have trainers, therapists time. What I need is the woman I saw last night." "Do you still have her?" Aisha nodded, tears pricking her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Good." Eleanor said, clapping her hands. "Be here tomorrow, 7 a.m. We start then." As Aisha left the studio, the city felt different, alive with possibility. The honking taxis sounded like an orchestra warming up the gray sky, full of promise. But beneath the hope, a new realization was taking root. The Caldwells hadn't just humiliated her last night, they'd been the architects of her family's ruin years ago. The viral story had given her a platform, and Eleanor's offer had given her a stage. But this wasn't just about her comeback. It was about justice, about telling a story that had been buried too long. Aisha knew with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified her that her dance was far from over. Aisha Thompson stood in the wings of the majestic theater, her heart pounding as the stage lights warmed the air around her. It was the opening night of Resonance Eleanor Hayes's new Broadway show, and Aisha was the lead, a role she'd earned not through an audition, but through the fire and defiance she'd shown at the Grand Astoria Ballroom months ago. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of grueling rehearsals, physical therapy to rebuild her dancer's body, and emotional reckonings that had left her both exhausted and exhilarated. Her muscles ached from the relentless training, but it was a good ache, a reminder of the life she'd reclaimed. The stage smelled of polished wood and anticipation, a scent that pulled her back to her days at the Harlem Dance Academy when the world had seemed full of possibility. Tonight, it was hers again. The orchestra tuned up a low hum of strings and woodwinds filling the theater, and Aisha adjusted her costume, a flowing, deep indigo dress that moved like water with her steps. She was no longer the invisible waitress in black socks. She was a star, and the sold-out audience beyond the curtain was here to see her. The journey to this moment had been anything but simple. After her viral tango with Preston Caldwell, the arrogant heir to Caldwell Properties, Aisha's life had transformed overnight. The story of her defiance, outdancing a millionaire, and walking away from his $10,000 bribe had exploded across the internet thanks to Marcus Reed's vivid photos and Vibe Pulse's searing article. The GoFundMe, titled "A Tip Jar for the Gala Dancer," had surpassed $75,000 money Aisha had used to cover her mother's medical bills and move her parents to a better apartment. But the real turning point had come when Eleanor Hayes, the legendary Broadway choreographer, offered her the lead in Resonance. The role was demanding a blend of technical precision and raw emotional storytelling, and Aisha had thrown herself into it with a ferocity that surprised even herself. Every rehearsal had been a battle, not just to regain her physical strength, but to confront the pain and loss that had defined her life for the past 5 years. Each step she took on the studio floor was a reclamation, a refusal to let her past define her future. But the story didn't end with her triumph at the gala, or her casting in Resonance. The revelation that Caldwell Properties Preston's family empire had bankrupted her father's auto repair shop through a predatory contract loophole had added a deeper layer to her victory. Aisha had shared her full story in a follow-up interview with Marcus Reed, published by Vibe Pulse, under the headline, "The Dancer's Debt Aisha Thompson on the True Cost of the Caldwell Empire." In it, she spoke with quiet dignity about her father's ruined business, her mother's illness, and the years she'd spent working to keep her family afloat. She didn't seek pity or revenge, she simply told the truth, connecting Preston's casual cruelty at the gala to the calculated ruthlessness of his family's business practices. The article was a bombshell sparking outrage across social media and prompting government regulators to investigate Caldwell Properties' waterfront project. The Caldwell name, once synonymous with untouchable wealth, had become a byword for arrogance and exploitation. In the Caldwell penthouse office overlooking Central Park, the fallout was catastrophic. Preston Caldwell Sr., a man whose icy pragmatism had built an empire, watched his company's stock plummet another 5% as the public turned against them. The New York Post ran a scathing editorial, and even the St. Augustine's Children's Fund, a longtime beneficiary of Caldwell donations, issued a statement distancing itself from the family. Preston Jr.'s public apology, delivered at a press conference that was more circus than contrition, had only deepened the damage. Standing at a podium, his voice flat, and his eyes fixed on the wall, he'd read a scripted statement filled with corporate jargon. "I deeply regret my actions at the gala, and any distress caused to Ms. Thompson." The reporters had pounced, shouting questions he didn't answer. "Have you apologized to Aisha personally? Is it true your company destroyed her father's business?" Preston Jr. was whisked away by security, leaving behind a storm of contempt. The media called it a coward's apology, a hollow gesture that only solidified the narrative the Caldwells were villains, and Aisha was the hero who'd exposed them. Now, as Aisha stood backstage, she felt the weight of that narrative. She wasn't just dancing for herself tonight, she was dancing for every person who'd ever been dismissed, undervalued, or crushed by those with more power. She thought of her father, James, who was in the audience tonight, his face lined with pride, despite the stroke that had weakened his body. Her mother, Clara, was there too, her wheelchair positioned in the front row, her smile a beacon of strength. Aisha had invited them to see her reclaim the stage, to witness the daughter they'd raised rise above the pain of their past. She'd also invited Marcus Reed, whose photos and articles had given her story wings. He was in the audience with his camera, ready to capture this new chapter. The house lights dimmed, and the stage manager's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Places." Aisha took a deep breath, letting the music of resonance, a haunting blend of classical and contemporary, fill her lungs. The curtain rose, and she stepped into the light. The performance was transcendent. Resonance told the story of a woman who loses her family, her home, and her voice only to rebuild herself through dance. Aisha's movements were a revelation, each step a blend of technical mastery and raw emotion. She leaped, spun, and fell with a grace that made the audience gasp, her body telling a story of grief, defiance, and rebirth. The choreography, designed by Eleanor Hayes, was demanding, but Aisha made it look effortless, her indigo dress flowing like a river as she moved. In one pivotal scene, she danced alone under a single spotlight, her movements mirroring the tango from the gala, sharp, passionate, unyielding. The audience was silent, captivated, their breaths held as she poured her soul into the stage. When the final note faded and Aisha struck her closing pose, head high and arms outstretched, the theater erupted. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation that shook the walls. Aisha felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming joy of being seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. Backstage, Eleanor Hayes met her with a rare smile. "You didn't just dance tonight, Aisha," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You changed the room. You changed the story." Aisha nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. The reviews would come later, and they would be glowing. The New York Times would call her a revelation, a dancer whose every movement is a manifesto of resilience. But in that moment, all she could think about was her parents waiting in the lobby to embrace her. When she found them, her father's eyes were wet. his voice hoarse as he said, "I always knew you'd find your way back." Her mother squeezed her hand, her grip strong despite her illness. "You're our light, Aisha," she whispered. Marcus Reed approached his camera slung around his neck, a grin on his face. "I got the shots," he said. "But honestly, no photo could capture what you did out there." The next day, Aisha sat down with Marcus for another interview, this time for a feature in The Atlantic, titled "The Dancer Who Rewrote Her Story." It was less about the gala and more about her journey, her training, her sacrifices, her comeback. Aisha spoke candidly not just about her triumph, but about the systemic barriers she'd faced as a black woman in a world that often overlooked her. She talked about the importance of art, how it had saved her when nothing else could, and how she hoped her story would inspire others to fight for their dreams. "The Caldwells thought they could buy my dignity," she said, her voice steady. "But dignity isn't for sale. It's in your talent, your truth, your refusal to be small. I danced for me, for my family, for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong." The article ended with a call to action, urging readers to support arts education and advocate for equity to ensure that no one's talent is buried under the weight of circumstance. The impact of Aisha's story rippled far beyond the theater. The investigation into Caldwell properties gained momentum, with regulators uncovering a pattern of predatory practices that had harmed countless small businesses like her father's. The company's stock continued to slide, and Preston Sr. was forced to step down as CEO, his empire crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. Preston Jr., once a fixture in Manhattan's social scene, had become a pariah, his name a cautionary tale. Aisha, meanwhile, became a symbol of resilience, her story inspiring fundraisers for arts programs in underserved communities and scholarships for young dancers of color. Shavidi visited schools sharing her journey and teaching workshops, her presence a reminder that talent could thrive even in the face of adversity. As Aisha stood in her new apartment, a small but bright space in Harlem paid for with her Broadway salary, she looked out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling like stars. She thought about the lesson her journey had taught her. True worth isn't measured in money or status, but in the courage to stand up for your truth. The $10,000 dare had been meant to break her, but it had set her free, exposing not just Preston's arrogance, but the deeper injustices his family represented. Aisha's story wasn't just about a dance. It was about dignity, resilience, and the power of art to heal and transform. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The spotlight was fickle, and the wounds of her past would always be there. But she also knew she had a voice now, one that could inspire others to rise, to fight, to create. For those who heard her story, the message was clear. No one's worth is defined by their circumstances. Aisha's triumph was a call to action, to support one another, to champion the arts, to challenge systems that devalue human potential. It was a reminder that everyone has a spark, a talent, a story worth telling, and that sometimes all it takes is one bold moment to change everything. As Aisha prepared for her next performance, she felt a quiet strength settle in her bones. She wasn't just dancing for herself anymore. She was dancing for every dreamer who'd been told to stay small, proving that, with courage and integrity, they could steal the spotlight and rewrite their own story.